Have you ever felt powerless? Powerless as men in red coats seized your harvest, as noble officers mocked your accent, as your children trembled at the crack of a whip. What you are about to hear may shock you. Stay with me until the end. For too long, humble farmers, weary soldiers, mothers, and even the elderly have endured humiliation at the hands of the English. Their wealth bought privilege. Their titles excused cruelty. They believed dignity belonged only to them, while betrayal and suffering were left for us. But within this struggle burns something they cannot extinguish: the unyielding spirit of the patriot. Freedom is not a gift. It is a sacrifice. It is the price paid in blood, in silence, in wounds carried unseen. And yet, despite the chains, despite the mockery, our people stand, bruised but unbroken, humiliated but not defeated. Do you feel it? The whisper of revolt, the shadow of sacrifice, the seed of light that grows even in the darkest soil. This is the story of one woman, and of a moment when faith itself became a weapon. Welcome, my fellow patriots. From which city are you watching today? Check if you're already subscribed. Give this video a like. And now, let's begin our story. Under the pale light of a gray morning, the bell of Bracken Hollow tolled with a hollow clang, summoning the villagers to the green. Soldiers in scarlet lined the square, muskets gleaming, bayonets fixed like teeth bared at prey. The garrison loomed above them, a fortress of stone and arrogance. Major Jonathan Hargrove stood at its heart, his polished boots planted deep in the soil of a land that was not his voice dripping disdain as he surveyed the colonists assembled below. Farmers with calloused hands, mothers clutching thin children, elders bent by labor all stood silent, their shame magnified beneath the cold gaze of English steel. Rebecca Marlowe, the woman who had come with little more than her herbs, her Bible, and her conviction, stepped forward not in pride, but in duty. She had given bread to the hungry, whispered comfort to the dying, tended wounds with hands unshaken by fear. Yet in the eyes of the Crown's officer, such mercy was not virtue, it was insolence. Hargrove sneered, calling her faith superstition, her kindness rebellion. He summoned her to the center, and before the eyes of her people, he spat words that cut sharper than blades. He mocked her vows of chastity, declaring them a mask for weakness. He seized the small wooden cross she carried, grinding it into the mud beneath his heel, a deliberate desecration meant to break both spirit and symbol. Rebecca's green eyes did not flinch, but the villagers gasped, some weeping silently, others clenching fists that dared not rise. Hargrove was not finished. He ordered her knees forced into the sludge of the parade ground, where soldiers jeered, their laughter echoing like drums of contempt. A woman of faith made spectacle, a servant of compassion dragged into filth. Public dignity shattered, her shame became the spectacle of imperial triumph. Children watched, their innocence pierced by a lesson carved in cruelty, that the English crown held no respect for virtue or piety, only obedience. Old men turned their faces away, unable to endure the sight, while militia soldiers, unarmed and outnumbered, stood powerless, swallowing their rage. It was not just Rebecca's humiliation, it was theirs. Her degradation reflected the contempt the empire bore for every colonist, every field hand, every soul that longed for liberty. Hargrove raised his hand and silence fell. "This is what awaits those who defy the crown," he declared, voice swelling with the authority of tyranny. The scarlet ranks roared approval, their bayonets catching the sun like fire. But beneath the hush that followed, something else stirred, a murmur in the hearts of the oppressed. The insult, the shame, the deliberate degradation did not weaken them as Hargrove intended. Instead, it planted the seed of rebellion, small yet alive, buried in the mud where Rebecca knelt. For humiliation can become revelation, betrayal can awaken the journey toward transformation, and sacrifice, when born with unbroken will, can ignite the hidden truth that no empire dares acknowledge. Dignity cannot be stolen, it can only be surrendered. Rebecca's silence that day spoke louder than any cry. Her stillness became defiance. Her downcast eyes shone with the reflection of every villager's suppressed fury. The officer believed he had crushed her, but the people saw something else, a patriot rising not with weapons, but with unyielding conviction. The struggle for independence is not born in victories, but in moments like these, when shame corrodes chains, when disgrace forges resolve, when the insult meant to destroy becomes the spark that unites. Rebecca was no soldier, no general, yet in her broken posture there was the shadow of a future uprising. What Hargrove could not understand was that his cruelty had transformed a quiet healer into a symbol. The English believed they had staged a lesson in obedience. In truth, they had staged the birth of defiance. The villagers left the square in silence, but their silence was not submission. It was the silence before a storm, before decisions were made in darkened barns, before revelations whispered in prayer became vows of rebellion. The garrison's laughter faded, but the memory remained, carved into the soul of Bracken Hollow. Rebecca's public disgrace would not be forgotten. It would be carried like a scar, a reminder of betrayal and a prophecy of transformation yet to come. The road ahead promised struggle, sacrifice, and decisions that would test the marrow of every patriot. Yet from that day forward, none could deny that the flame of liberty had been lit not with muskets, but with the quiet endurance of a woman dragged into the mud. The square emptied beneath the watchful eyes of scarlet uniforms, yet the echo of mockery clung to the stones like blood that will not wash away. Rebecca remained on her knees long after the boots had marched off. The imprint of degradation pressed into her body but not her soul, and around her, though none dared move to lift her, the witnesses carried the wound deeper than any lash could cut. Martha Haley, her mother, frail and trembling, clutched her shawl to her chest as if to hide the tremor in her bones. She had watched her daughter dragged through shame, powerless to shield her, powerless to defend the dignity that had been stripped in full daylight. Yet within her weakness stirred a vow, silent but firm, that no empire could extinguish the fire of a mother's grief. Beside her limped Thomas Clay, the wheelwright, crippled since a malicious skirmish years before. A man whose hands once built wheels that carried harvests to markets, now robbed by crown-backed merchants. He leaned heavily on his cane, his eyes fixed not on the officer's cruelty, but on the villagers' bowed heads. To him the disgrace was not singular, it was shared, a scar branded upon every colonist's back. He whispered not to be heard, yet his lips formed words that others caught. They will pay. In the shadows of the tavern's porch, a cluster of militiamen stood silent, men who had given service to the crown only to be betrayed by debts, taxes, and the sneers of wealthy traders who claimed loyalty was measured in gold. Their fists clenched against their sides. Their silence was not surrender. It was the weight of fury, pressed down until the time was ripe to release it. Each of them felt the moment not as bystanders, but as soldiers stripped of honor. The crown had disgraced one woman, yet in doing so, it had mocked them all. And among the crowd, half hidden by skirts and cloaks, a small boy crouched low. His name was Elias, barely 10 summers old, his eyes too young for rebellion, yet already old with sorrow. In his trembling hands he held a scrap of paper, dirty, torn but precious. Upon it, scrawled in rough ink, were the very words Major Hargrove had spat at Rebecca. An insult preserved, a wound recorded, a hidden truth carried away in the pocket of a child. What he did not know, what none yet knew, was that this fragile proof would become more than memory. It would be read aloud one day in a barn lit by lanterns, before men and women who would rise together and claim the dignity denied them. The villagers dispersed, returning to their cabins, their barns, their thin suppers. Yet the air was thick with silence, the kind of silence that conceals fire beneath ash. Words of prayer became whispers of rebellion. Mothers who once prayed only for bread began praying for courage. Fathers who bowed their heads to soldiers now sharpened old blades in secret. Old men who remembered humiliation after humiliation now spoke of sacrifice. The hidden truth spread like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to stop. Rebecca herself, though soiled with mud, walked back to her dwelling with no escort but her shadow. Her steps were slow, her body bent, yet her eyes were unbroken. She carried no weapon, no banner, only the weight of what had been done. She did not speak. She did not need to. Every villager who saw her pass felt both shame and revelation. If one woman could endure such disgrace and remain whole, what excuse had they for silence? The garrison feasted that night. Music of fiddles, laughter of officers, the clink of goblets filled the stone halls. To them, the day was victory. To them, humiliation was conquest. But outside their fortress walls, beyond the glow of torches, in huts, where hunger dwelled and in fields where sweat turned to frost, the insult echoed. The officer had meant to crush a spirit. Instead, he had sown rebellion. Martha Hull sat awake, whispering psalms, though her lips quivered with something stronger than devotion. Thomas Clay pressed charcoal to wood, sketching the crown's emblem and striking it through with a cross, a symbol he would later hide beneath floorboards. The militiamen gathered quietly, no muskets in hand, but with words exchanged like oaths. They spoke of betrayal by merchants, of taxes that starved children, of dignity trampled in the mud of the parade ground. Their silence gave way to decisions that would set them on a journey from submission to resistance. And the boy Elias, beneath a thin blanket, clutched his torn scrap of paper against his chest. His young heart did not yet understand sacrifice or liberty, but he understood shame. He understood that words can wound deeper than blades, and that truth, once written, cannot be erased. That night, as his eyes closed, he dreamed of standing on the green, again, not as a child cowering, but as a patriot with a voice that would not be silenced. The seeds had been planted, not with speeches, not with muskets, but with disgrace turned to resolve. Every villager carried it differently, as grief, as rage, as prayer, as a secret vow. Yet together, though unspoken, they were bound. Bound by insult, bound by betrayal, bound by the revelation that independence would not be granted, must be seized. The garrison slept in arrogance, unaware that their cruelty had awakened what no decree, no lash, no gallows could restrain. The transformation had begun. From humiliation would rise rebellion. From disgrace would come dignity reclaimed. And from the silence of the oppressed would emerge a thunder no empire could withstand. Right. The flame of freedom lives in me. Night fell like a shroud over Bracken Hollow, but the garrison windows still burned with drink and laughter. Rebecca moved beneath that light as if under a gallows beam. She wrapped her shawl tight, hid her hair, and went where pain had pooled. A farmer lay on a straw pallet in the market shed, his shirt dark with a slow leak of blood. Shot during a scuffle, the merchants called a necessary correction. He apologized for staining her hands. She told him there was nothing to forgive. Thread to needle, needle to flesh. She whispered a psalm, steady as a drumbeat. With every stitch she bound more than skin, she bound resolve. She bound the wound they all carried and refused to name. The man's wife pressed her lips to Rebecca's knuckles and wept, not for the pain, for the mercy, for the fierce, simple dignity of a woman who would kneel in filth and still lift a soul from despair. From the market she crossed to a cabin where the wind rattled shutters like chains. An old woman burned with fever, her breath shallow, her eyes clouded by years of insult. Crown taxes had emptied her cupboards. Crown men had taken her son for service and sent him back a stranger. Rebecca crushed willow bark, brewed bitter tea, bathed the woman's temples with cool cloths, and sang a hymn so soft even the rats paused to listen. The fever cracked at dawn. The old woman's hands found Rebecca's face and traced the outline like a prayer answered. "They think mercy is weakness," she rasped, "but mercy breaks iron." Rebecca kissed her brow and left a pouch of herbs beneath the pillow. The garrison counted coin and called it order. She counted heartbeats and called it allegiance. At the edge of the green, a soldier's child shivered in a doorway. His father had been posted to a distant road. His mother scrubbed floors for a noble's wife and slept on a kitchen mat. The boy had no shoes. He had the eyes of someone who had learned to make himself small when boots approached. Rebecca knelt until they were level. She placed bread in his hands, one loaf, then another, wrapped in cloth. She told him to hide it under the hearthstone. She did not ask if he was hungry. Hunger was the language of this land. You could see it in the thin wrists of girls, in the cracked lips of old men, in the way boys stared at the garrison's waste buckets as if they hid treasure. The boy nodded, a vow without words. She had given him sustenance, but she had given him something larger, the sense that someone stood beside him against the tide. In the tavern where shadows crawled like barn cats, quiet, Conversations tightened into cords of purpose. Thomas Clay leaned near a candle stump, his bad leg stretched out, his palm black with charcoal. He sketched a circle, then a wheel with spokes, then lines that looked like paths through woods no map had claimed. The militiamen watched, eyes narrowed, faces blank for safety. Rebecca came to their table with a kettle of broth and a bundle of bandages. They did not raise their voices. They did not say revolt. They said winter stores. They said clearing stones at night. They said a delivery wagon that could shake off a pursuit if a certain wheel were cut to lift on roots and slide over narrow gullies. Thomas tapped the sketch. Balance, he murmured. Strength hides in simple shapes. No one spoke of muskets. No one spoke of powder. Yet the air smelled of decisions almost made. Her hands made small miracles. A splinter excised from a girl's heel. A sprain wrapped tight enough to bear weight. A stitch slipped behind the ear of a man, too, proud to limp before the redcoats. But each touch carried a charge. Each blessing turned shame into stamina. In a loft above the smithy, she taught Martha Halla how to brew a poultice that drew heat from a wound. Martha's fingers shook, not from age alone, from grief curdled into iron. They dragged you through the mud, Martha whispered. Rebecca pressed their foreheads together. I walked through it, she said. Not defiance. Definition. A hidden truth set down like a cornerstone. Martha straightened. The tremor eased. Courage can be borrowed. It can also be taught. She left baskets where the garrison would not bother to look, under a trough, behind a woodpile, in a hollow tree scarred by lightning, a loaf, a strip of salt pork, 3 onions, dried mint for coughs, a folded scrap with a verse and a single word beneath it. Soon, not a threat, a promise of transformation. She did not sign her name. She did not need to. The village knew the handwriting of hope. On market day she walked past the stalls of crown-backed traders, their scales always tilted, their eyes always measured. A merchant with a London waistcoat smirked at her patched dress. Charity, he said, breeds laziness. She picked up an apple with a bruise like a purple fist. Charity, she replied, breeds loyalty. He laughed. A horse kicked at a fly. Somewhere a door slammed. Humiliation lived in such moments, not only in whips and orders, but in the daily drizzle of contempt that soaked the skin and froze the marrow. She set the apple down and felt the gaze of the villagers gather around her like a cloak. They did not smile. They did not bow. They simply stood a little straighter. Elias, the boy with the hidden paper, trailed her at a distance. He protected the scrap like a relic. He had copied the officer's slur twice in cramped letters to make sure memory could not be erased by fear. He had also added a line of his own, "We remember." When she realized he shadowed her steps, she led him to the low stone wall behind the meeting house. She pushed a loose rock aside and revealed a crevice stuffed with folded notes, small as a thumb. Hands had been busy. Prayers, names of those who could be trusted. A list of families short on flour. At the bottom lay a single feather, black as a night without stars. What does it mean? He asked. That silence can fly, she said. He smiled like a child and a soldier at once. The garrison's arrogance spread like frost. An officer rode through the lane and forced a cart into a ditch so that his horse's hooves would not get muddy. A noble's wife threw a pail on a washerwoman and said the stain was insolence. A wealthy importer banned militiamen from his door and hung a sign that read "No credit to rebels." Every insult rippled. Every shame found an echo. Yet with each cruelty came a counterweight. A militiaman carried the washerwoman's wet bundle under his cloak and hung it by his own fire. The cart was raised by 6 hands and pushed back onto the road. The sign was copied onto a scrap, then burned over a candle in the tavern's back room as men watched the letters curl into ash. Quiet rites, quiet oaths, independence rehearsed in miniature. Rebecca's healing became a kind of map of the village's wounds. A sailor's scar reopened by a merchant's whip. A farmhand's back seamed by old lashes from a tax collector's rope. A girl's ribs visible because her mother had paid a tariff before buying grain. She touched each injury with care, speaking the names of bones, the names of herbs, the names of saints. She believed names were keys. She believed blankness was the empire's most potent weapon, a refusal to see, to say, to acknowledge. So she named everything: pain, rage, loyalty, duty. She named liberty aloud in kitchens and barns until the word fit the walls like it had always lived there. At dusk she crossed the river where it thinned to a ribbon between reeds. There she met Thomas Clay and two militiamen whose faces were dark. With soot, they carried nothing a patrol could seize. Only knowledge. The bridge pilings had rot hidden deep. The road beyond the mill had a culvert so narrow a cannon would choke. The ridge oak leaned more each storm and would fall with one well-placed cut. She listened, asked, decided, not as a commander, but as the spine of a body learning to stand. "We cannot match their gold," Thomas said. "We can match their will," she answered. "And we can surpass it." The men did not cheer. They nodded. Once, real oaths do not need noise. She returned home to find her mother waiting with a pot of thin stew and a look that mingled pride with terror. Martha wrapped Rebecca's scraped palms in cloth dipped in comfrey. "They watch you," she said. "Let them," Rebecca whispered. "They will learn what faith looks like when it refuses to kneel." Martha drew a breath that sounded like a decision. The candle guttered. The room fell into a hush that felt like a church, like a courtroom, like a battlefield, held in the fist of the future. Word moved like a fox through hedges. In barns, men traced lines in chaff with broken twigs. In kitchens, women stitched secret pockets into skirts to carry flint and twine. In the meeting-house loft, a copy of the King's proclamation had been nailed to a beam. Someone, perhaps Elias, perhaps another child brave enough to climb, had pricked holes in the parchment so that sunlight pierced it at dawn and cast a constellation on the floorboards. The villagers began to step over that pattern as if crossing a threshold. Each step said the same thing: "We do not consent." With every act of kindness the balance shifted. A loaf left on a sill was a message. A prayer offered over a fever was a tactic. A wound closed was a soldier returned to his place in the line no one could yet see. The empire called it sedition to feed the hungry without a license. The nobles called it theft when a miller ground grain after curfew for a widow with 5 mouths to fill. Rebecca called it duty, not the duty to a crown. The duty one human owes another when injustice has set the table and poured the wine. Snow threatened. The river scummed with thin ice. Hunger sharpened every face. The garrison prepared a winter ball and hung lanterns from the battlements as if to mock the dark. They sent an invitation to the wealthiest merchant in town, the man who forbade militiamen to step on his stoop. He offered to donate barrels of rum. He offered to hang a tapestry embroidered, with the royal crest bright with thread and greed. The villagers took note. They measured the distance between the storehouse and the kitchen door. They measured the pace of a guard who grew sleepy after the second bell. They measured the thickness of a shutter whose latch had never been fixed. Measurements are a kind of prayer when a people has chosen freedom and must earn it with patience. On the last night before the snow, Rebecca met a circle in the tavern's cellar. Thomas Clay, 2 militiamen whose names were never written. Martha Halley, shawl drawn over her hair. Elias pressed to the wall, wide-eyed, clutching the scrap with the officer's insult. A candle burned low. They did not argue. They did not boast. They spoke of a wagon that might overturn in the right place, of a lamp that might go out at the precise moment, of a doorway that might open because a hinge had been loosened by accident. They spoke of nothing at all that a court could punish. Yet in that cellar, the true court convened, not of law, of conscience. The verdict was simple. Dignity would be reclaimed, and they would pay the price demanded by history. Sacrifice without applause. Rebecca took the paper from Elias and read the vile words again. She did not flinch. She lifted her eyes and, in a voice that filled the small room, recited the counterline the boy had written. "We remember." The candle sputtered. A draft crept along the floor. Somewhere above, a fiddle tuned for the garrison ball. The sound floated down like perfume turned rancid. "We will give them a memory in return," Thomas said. No one smiled. No one trembled. The moment settled like snow on a field that waits for footprints. They filed out 2 by 2 into the brittle air. Breath smoked. Stars shivered. The village looked asleep. It was not. Windows glowed faintly. Fingers moved behind curtains. Knives were honed in careful strokes. Mercy had done its work. The quiet axe had gathered like a tide behind a breakwater. One more insult, one more seizure of a harvest, one more child whipped for stepping too close to a noble's carriage, and the water would crest. Rebecca stood at the door of the meeting house and listened to the wind gnawing the eaves. She felt neither triumph nor fear, only the gravity of a path chosen, a journey without a map, guided by revelations that rose from the very soil. Liberty is not granted, independence is carved, dignity is defended every hour a people refuses to bow. A bell far off chimed the quarter. Dogs barked and fell silent. The river cracked a little, then froze still. She turned toward the garrison's lanterns, those bright false stars, and let the cold burn her lungs until they ached. Somewhere inside, the officers toasted crown and coin. Somewhere inside, a merchant preened in borrowed finery. They believed their world eternal. They could not hear the soft machinery assembling in the dark, the mercy, the memory, the measured steps that would become a march. The snow began at last, thin as ash at first, then steady. Rebecca lifted her face to it and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would ask more courage, more patience, more sacrifice. She opened her hands to the falling white, and for a heartbeat it seemed the sky itself whispered a vow. Morning rose with a bitter light, thin and metallic, as if the sky itself had been hammered into armor. Major Jonathan Hargrove rode onto the green with 2 officers and a file of redcoats, jaw clenched, eyes bright with vindictive purpose. His spectacle had not broken Bracken Hollow. He would break it by decree. He announced new levies with a smile that was not a smile grain to the garrison. Wood to the garrison, coin to the garrison, tribute wrung from empty barns and frostbitten orchards. The order was nailed to the meeting-house door with 3 blows of a musket butt. Each strike was a sentence, each nail a threat. The villagers read and felt the old ache of disgrace settle in the ribs, but they did not lower their heads as before. They stared back, quietly, grimly. That quiet enraged him. Arrests followed, not for crimes but for convenience. A miller was seized for short measure, though his scales were fairer than any merchant's. 2 militiamen were dragged from their beds for seditious talk, which meant they had spoken to each other after dusk. Thomas Clay was hauled into the square on the pretext that his broken wheel had blocked a road used by the crown. Hargrove circled him like a hawk. "A lame man slows the king's business," he said, and slapped the cane from Thomas's grip. It struck the stones with a crack that made children flinch. Thomas did not bow. He steadied himself on the edge of a trough and met the officer's gaze with a look as cold as iron. A soldier shoved him to his knees. The gesture was meant to be instructional. Instead, it looked like an oath being sworn to a power not of this earth. He insulted the minister on Sunday, striding down the aisle while the psalm was still rising. He called the sermon unseasoned, then demanded the preacher bless the crown by name. When the old man hesitated, his voice frail, his hands trembling over the worn Bible, Hargrove laughed and ordered the congregation to stand. No one moved, not one farmer, not one mother, not one child. The stillness was a blade. Hargrove's smile thinned. He spat on the floorboards near the pulpit and left the sanctuary with his hat still on. The nobles' wives tittered by the door, jewels shaking like coins. The poor filed into the snow without a word, each bootprint a verdict. Bribes became policy. The garrison gates were no longer merely iron, they were a ledger. A man could buy back his tools if he left a bag of flour. A woman could retrieve her arrested husband if she brought a hen and her wedding ring. A merchant could secure escort for his wagons if he slipped a sealed purse to an officer in the mess. Hargrove called it order. The wealthy called it opportunity. The village called it betrayal. Inside those walls, humiliation had a price, and dignity could be ransomed if you paid in wheat, in cattle, in shame. Rebecca walked among the wounded bargains with steady steps. She found the miller's wife weeping over an empty bin and pressed a loaf into her hands. She found the minister kneeling alone in the dark sanctuary and bound the cracked skin of his knuckles where he had clenched the lectern too hard. "I could not bless what denies mercy," he whispered. "Blessed the people," she said. "That blessing will stand." He smiled with tears in his eyes. A small restoration, a counterweight to degradation. Elias watched the arrests from a doorway, fists balled. He followed the soldiers at a distance as they marched 2 men to the garrison, and he counted the steps between posts, counted the moments when guards turned their heads to joke, counted the seconds a lantern swung unobserved. Numbers became knowledge. Knowledge became power. He scratched the figures onto chips of wood with a nail and hid them alongside the scrap with Hargrove's insult. A boy's arithmetic was turning into a map. Thomas Clay returned home after a day in the stocks, wrists raw, lips split, pride intact. He spoke little, he drew much. Wheels, ruts, the slant of a hill. He marked where a wagon might lose a barrel and where a team might rest in the shadows by the orchard wall. Decisions settled into place like stones in a ford. He took from his pocket a small iron hook, newly forged, the size of a finger, curved just so it could worry a latch like a crow worries a nut. He pressed it into Ilias's palm and shook his head. Not yet. The boy nodded, and the lesson cut deeper than any lecture. Patience is a form of courage. Hargrove pressed harder. He demanded the names of men who spoke in the tavern cellar. He threatened to billet soldiers in every home unless the levies were met. He sent officers to Martha Hale's door and accused her of harboring sedition because candles burned late in her window. They upended the chest at the foot of her bed. They jostled the table where Rebecca kept her herbs. They laughed at the psalms scratched on the wall. They left with a sack of oats and the last of the winter apples. Martha stood in the ruin of her small order and did not cry. She swept the floor as if sweeping a grave. Rebecca gathered the scattered thyme and rosemary and set them back in their jars. "They want us to break," Martha said. "We were never." "Clay for their hands," Rebecca answered. The words tasted like a revelation. In the market, an importer in a velvet coat mocked a farmer whose wagon carried turnips and grief. He paid with clipped coin and called it charity. When the farmer protested, the importer summoned a corporal and had the man's cap knocked into the mud. Rebecca stepped between them, not with a shout, with a question. "What is a debt owed to a people?" The merchant blinked. The crowd held still. The corporal smirked and flicked the cap again. The farmer picked it up, shook off the sludge, and put it on. He looked taller. Not taller in inches, taller in resolve. The seller of velvet found his laugh suddenly thin. Extortion stole more than goods. It stole sleep. It stole the ease of children's laughter. It stole songs from the evening. Yet theft produced its opposite. A ledger of grace filled in secret. The minister left a loaf at the wheelwright's door. The wheelwright mended a widow's cart for nothing. A widow took in the child of a soldier posted far away. The child brought water to the meeting house and watched the door with bright eyes. A chain of compassion tightened, link by link, until even fear felt its bite. At dusk, Hargrove called a public hearing inside the garrison yard. Villagers were herded between walls that smelled of damp stone and old smoke. He paraded the arrested men before them and demanded confessions. He mocked their accents, their boots, their patched sleeves. He insulted their fathers and their trades. He asked the minister if God had given him permission to defy the crown. The minister said, "God gave me permission to tell the truth." A murmur rose. A soldier slammed the butt of his musket on the cobbles, and the sound ripped the air. Hargrove smiled like a man who has found a new blade. "Then speak truth," he said to the crowd, "and tell me who among you whispered treason." Silence followed. Not empty. Full of decision. Full of a word not yet spoken. Aloud, "Liberty." He ordered the men flogged at dawn if no names were given. He ordered grain seized from any barn that couldn't show a receipt stamped with the crown's seal. He ordered every child over 10 to report to the gate for inspection, which meant counting bodies that might one day carry muskets against him. He ordered and ordered, as if a storm could be threatened back into the clouds. Then he turned his back and left the yard, confident the weight of fear would do the rest. That night, the church bell did not ring, but its silence was a summons. Women moved first, carrying baskets like parishioners carry candles. Men followed with sacks stitched inside their coats. In lofts and cellars, thin stores were redistributed. The old received broth. The young received boots. The arrested men received words slipped through a crack in the yard wall. Words that said, "Hold. Hold as a shoreline holds against a tide that breaks itself to foam." Rebecca moved house to house, an ember in a shawl, her hands steady even as her jaw tightened against the cold. She paused by the minister's door and found him writing by a stump of candle. He looked up and said, "I will read from Exodus." She nodded. Slavery, passage, covenant, not politics. Scripture turned into a map. Elias crept to the gate and counted again. He listened for the pattern of steps, the lazy pause, the throat cleared at the same spot. He felt the small iron hook heavy in his pocket and did not use it. Decision is discipline. He walked away when his heart wanted to leap. He tucked the hook beside the scrap in its hiding place and imagined the day both would be carried into light. Proof and tool, wound and remedy. A boy's keepsakes becoming a people's instruments. Hargrove dreamt of obedience. He woke to frost on the panes and a rumor he could not trace. The minister's insult had become a story of courage. The miller's arrest had become a parable of endurance. The garrison's greed had become a banner word, whispered in hallways. Revolt. He doubled the guards. He sent riders to neighboring towns with warnings. He sharpened the sword he rarely used. He paced the battlements and looked down on roofs dusted with white. He saw chimneys smoking. He did not see the slow gathering of will beneath those shingles. No tyrant ever does. The day set that would bring his dawn floggings. The yard was swept. The whip laid out on a stool like a ceremony's instrument. Villagers gathered, faces gray with winter and resolve. Rebecca stood at the edge, hands folded, eyes on the men bound to posts. She breathed in the bitter air and tasted iron and ash. The minister stepped forward and opened his Bible to a page already marked by a trembling ribbon. Thomas Clay leaned against the wall, leg braced, jaw set. Elias pressed to the slats, small and watchful, counting one more time. The officer lifted his chin and signaled, and from the far end of the yard, beyond the reach of the lanterns, beyond the angle of the captain's comfortable sight line, a different signal answered, quiet, precise, carried by the rhythm of those who have chosen a road and will not turn aside. They reached Bracken Hollow before the frost had finished writing on the fences. Ephraim Hale rode first, shoulders broad from years of stones and plow, beard rimed with cold. Isaac Turner came beside him, a militiaman whose calluses had once been earned with a hoe, then with a musket, then with a penance of hunger. They had heard the tale on the road, the officer's decree, the arrests, the threat of lashes at dawn, humiliation paraded as law, tribute gouged from empty barns, a minister mocked in his own pulpit, betrayal dressed in scarlet. They did not curse the sky. They dismounted and tied their horses at the tavern rail as if returning to fields they owned. Ownership is a state of mind before it is a deed. Inside, breath steamed. The room was packed tight with ordinary faces. Poor widows with shawls pinned at the throat. A deserter with eyes like winter wells. Boys with narrow wrists and jaws set hard. Thomas Clay leaned over a crude map cut into the tabletop with a knife point. Rebecca stood near the hearth, sleeve rolled, binding a militiaman's wrist with linen. She did not look up when the door opened. She did not need to. Martha Hale's hand rose to her lips and then settled, steady. Ephraim's voice landed like an axe in seasoned wood. We take the garrison, not a toast, a verdict. Isaac added the terms, plain. As fence posts, expose their ledger, free our men. Bring Hargrove to account before the people he smears. No rhetoric of glory, only the grammar of duty. The deserter lifted his chin. And if we die? Isaac did not blink. Then we tithe blood to purchase dignity for those who live. The room exhaled. The words spread like heat from coals. Sacrifice. Thomas tapped the carved lines. Lanterns here. 2 sentries who trade jokes on the half-minute. Gate latch poor. Wall seam by the drain. Loose. Mortar. A child could slip. Elias was already nodding, every number memorized. He drew from his pocket the iron hook he had promised not to use and set it down as an offering. Transformations begin with small betrayals of fear. We need proof, Rebecca said softly. Not only bruises, paper that shows bribes, orders that show contempt. Isaac grinned without amusement. A noble keeps accounts like a priest keeps psalms. The deserter spat in the ash. They keep accounts so London can praise them. For efficient cruelty, decisions fell into place. Martha would light a candle in the meeting-house window if patrols thinned by the granary. Elias would run messages, 2 knocks for clear, 3 for danger. The minister would read a psalm loud enough to cover the creak of the north gate if heaven favored their timing. Widows would carry bread to the corner by the yard wall, loaves hollowed to hide flint. Every person a spoke, every spoke part of a wheel that could roll over stone. Ephraim spoke. To Rebecca last, near the door where fumes drifted from the cold. If I fail, he said, you take mother and the boy and you go. She shook her head. I do not flee. I know, he said, and smiled like a man closing his eyes before a prayer. Then promise me this. If I must fall, take what we seize to a place where it cannot be burned." She laid a hand on his chest, palm to wool, and felt the thud of a heart that had learned to keep its own counsel. "You will not fall for nothing," she said. A revelation passed between them. Not spoken, understood. They set the hour by the town's old clock, which ran a little slow in winter. A blessing. It made tyrants late to their own ceremonies. Ephraim chose the men who would slip the seam in the wall. Isaac chose those who would stage a quarrel at the south lane to pull a patrol wide. Thomas chose a boy with light feet to shadow the officer who kept the keys. Rebecca chose no role assigned to a soldier. She chose them all. She would stand where the wounded soon would be. She would stand where courage leaks and needs refilling. The wind rose. Snow returned, thin as smoke. They parted without clasping hands. Oaths make better roots when pressed into earth by deeds alone. Before dawn, the yard was swept for spectacle. Whip coil on a stool, posts ready. The officer in his cloak savoring the cold sting as if it belonged to him. Villagers pressed at the edge, breath pluming, eyes hollowed by nights without rest. The minister held his Bible and did not look at Hargrove. He looked at the men bound to wood, and at the children forced to learn obedience by watching pain. An empire teaches with shame. A nation is born by refusing the lesson. The signal left the far corner like a pulse under skin. A cough, a scrape, a tethered horse nickering once. The gate guard turned to grin at a jest only he understood. Isaac's decoy quarrel flared by the south lane. Two farmers shoving, a sack of turnips knocked open, curses, crafted to be worthy of arrest. The patrol moved. 5 heartbeats. 10. The latch breathed without a squeal because a patient hand had fed it bear fat the night before. Elias slipped in, small as a rumor. The iron hook kissed the key ring and lifted it like a prayer rising. Within the wall, the deserter hugged the stone and counted the sentry's steps. Thomas Clay, braced on his bad leg, set the wedge beneath the cart by the storehouse. One lean push later, and the axle jammed. A neat calamity. Lantern tipped, then died under a boot, and shadow swallowed the corner where the ledger office waited. Ephraim moved through that dark like he had moved in fields at night, with a farmer's certainty of where the ditch begins. He reached the door, pressed the hook, and felt the slide. Inside, the books gleamed with the smug shine of ink and theft. Receipts, seals, names of the poor traded for favors. He tore the page with the minister's fine. He took the entries that sold grain meant for widows. He found a list headed with a word that curdled the mouth. Inspections. Ages beside it. 10, 11, 12. He folded that page with a care that felt like grief. In the yard, Hargrove called for silence in a voice that expected obedience. The minister began to read a psalm, steady and loud. The tidewater rhythm of ancient deliverance pushing back against the officer's stage. Rebecca's eyes tracked movement along the wall. Elias reappeared with a nod that was almost a sob. The keys vanished under Rebecca's shawl and emerged in her hand at the prisoner's bonds. Rope whispered. Skin burned where hemp kissed raw wrist. Freedom sometimes begins with the humblest sound. The whip lifted. It did not fall. Not yet. A stone skittered from the north seam as Isaac's men flowed through. A woman cried out, a sound too sharp to be mere fear. It cut the yard like a bell tolling. Hargrove turned, cloak snapping. He saw movement where peasants should have been still. He saw Thomas braced, where crippled men should have cowered. He saw Rebecca's hand at a knot and understood, too late, that mercy had always been rebellious. Seize them, he shouted. But the guard nearest him hesitated, staring at the minister, then at the crowd, then at his own hands, as if suddenly ashamed of what they had been forced to praise. Shame can be a doorway, or a wall. He chose the doorway. He stepped back instead of forward. One man only. Yet one man alters a tide's lip. Ephraim burst from the ledger. Room with pages inside his coat and a face that looked like winter breaking. Isaac reached the bound men and cut the last rope with a blade hidden in his cuff. The deserter shoved the cart, and the jam snapped free and rolled, blocking the path to the gate with a clatter that sounded like a barricade and a hymn combined. For a breath, all time paused, a hinge between old order and something not yet named. Hargrove raised his pistol and aimed at Ephraim. The barrel trembled, not from fear, but from rage denied its theater. He spoke through his teeth of treason and subjects and king. The words fell dull on air suddenly crowded with a different language, liberty, honor, independence, responsibility. The villagers, who had been taught to attend spectacles of degradation, now watched a rite of restoration. They did not cheer. They held their breath as if the next lungful might be their first in years. A shot cracked from somewhere beyond the wall, not aimed to kill but to split. Attention! Snow dust leapt from the battlement. Pigeons burst up like smoke. Hargrove flinched. Ephraim moved. Isaac moved. Rebecca moved. The minister kept reading, voice firm as oak. And in that fragile opening, with proof in one coat and courage in 100 chests, the journey crossed a threshold it could no longer uncross, the hidden truth stepping into daylight where no decree could unmake it. Ephraim slammed the ledger onto the tavern table, and the room fell into a hush that felt like a held breath. Ink glistened like oil on water. Names, amounts, receipts stamped with a seal that smelled of London and scorn. Isaac turned the pages with a farmhand's care and a soldier's suspicion. Bribes catalogued as gratitudes. Fines recorded as moral restorations. Under inspections, the ages danced like a dirge. 10, 11, 12. Rebecca traced a line with one finger, as if she could feel the bruise each entry left on a human back. Then a thin paper slid loose from the binding, tucked, like a confession folded twice, sealed with wax bearing a ring none in Bracken Hollow had touched. Thomas Clay set his palm on it as if steadying a cart on a slope. "Open it," he said, voice rough. Ephraim cracked the seal and read. A letter from a merchant in the next county, a lord of warehouses and debt, congratulating Major Jonathan Hargrove for resolving incidents of peasant insolence and enclosing a payment for persuasion by example. Another line. The parcels along the river are to be cleared before spring. Tenant holdings broken. Obedience made visible. The ink didn't smear under Ephraim's thumb. It bit. Rebecca lifted her eyes and the room saw it. Humiliation had never been a drunken spasm. It was policy. The disgrace was a program. The insult was an order written in a rich man's hand so that a uniform could translate greed into law. Silence deepened. Not fear. Calculation. The widows drew closer, shawls brushing one another like wings at roost. The deserter's jaw tightened. He took the page and read the sum at the bottom. Gold enough to buy a village's winter. Paid to break a village's spine. Not only our backs, Isaac said softly. Our earth. Land to be carved like meat on a platter and served to men who never planted so much as a bean. Thomas tapped the margin where a neat diagram marked lots along the river. Numbers, stakes, future fences scrawled with a casual contempt that chilled more than any bayonet. Elias leaned over the table, eyes wide, and sounded out a phrase he had never expected to see, to be done without undue noise. The boy's voice cracked on the word noise, a child's echo of a grown man's plot. The letter passed to Martha Hole. Her hand shook, then steadied. They will not only starve us, she said, they will erase us. The minister arrived, face pale with cold and resolve, and Rebecca placed the page before him. He read, his lips moving in a rhythm older than any crown. He looked up and there was something like fire in the wells of his eyes. We thought we were pleading with a cruel man, he said. We have been pleading with a machine. The revelation carried through the village like a low bell. The garrison was no longer one officer's stage. It was a gear in a grander theft. Wealthy merchants in velvet offices. Generals sipping port while maps folded. Nobles tapping rings against glass as they set quotas for shame. A system that converted dignity into tax and independence into trespass. The raid changed shape. In an instant. Not revenge, resistance. Not the settling of a single score. The opening of a ledger the crown did not expect the poor to read. Decisions hardened. The plan widened. Proof must be protected, copied, carried beyond reach. Isaac drafted 4 riders in the back room, men who knew the winter roads, men whose horses would not refuse a frozen ford. 2 to the next towns. 1 to the printer who owed his life to a poultice Rebecca mixed last spring. 1 to a cousin who could speak before a county meeting without his tongue halting. The copies would move at dusk, folded into flour sacks and stitched into collars. Evidence would become gospel, read aloud where redcoats could not mute it with drums. Ephraim and Thomas scoured the ledger office again under dark. Behind a loose plank they found a second packet, a list of tenants marked recalcitrant, with notes like remove by candle and instruct through visible correction, a schedule for seizures, a sketch of a gallows drawn in an idle hand, obscene as a doodle in a child's primer. Isaac closed his eyes for a single breath. "This is the hidden truth," he said. "This is why the whip waits at dawn." He didn't speak anger, he spoke indictment. Hargrove sensed something fray. He stalked through the garrison, cursing the cold and the villagers' stubborn faces, ordered double patrols, accused his own corporal of softness. The officer smelled smoke where none burned. He sent a messenger to the merchant's estate warning that agitators have secured certain papers. He did not know that the messenger's mare had a loose shoe, and that the blacksmith's boy had hands quick as sparrows. The note never left Bracken Hollow. It found a new home in Rebecca's apron with the other sheets that turned private betrayal into public arithmetic. The town gathered by lamplight. No speeches. Only sentences as sharp as nails. They will take the river lots. They will pull down Aunt Ruth's fence. They will brand our boys as conscripts and call it duty. They will barter our faith for receipts. A farmer set his palm on the table. Fingers spread the way he used to measure seed. "We stand," he said. "We stand on land our dead planted." A murmur rose, not loud, but shaped. Liberty doesn't shout at first. It speaks in statements that sound like prayers and promises at once. Rebecca's voice was the quietest, and it carried farthest. If they could have bought our silence, they would have. They failed. If they could have broken our will, they would have. They failed. If they could have kept their sin in their books, they would have. They failed. Therefore, we must succeed. She looked to the minister, to Martha, to Elias. This is our journey now. Not merely to unbind wrists, to unbind a people. Pages were wrapped in oilcloth and handed to the riders. Elias tied one packet beneath his shirt with twine and met Rebecca's eyes. He was still a child. He was already a courier of a nation being born. "Do not run," she whispered. "Walk. Walk like a boy going for bread." He nodded, dignity settling on his small shoulders like a cloak. He stepped into the snow and did not look back. Hargrove chose spectacle to smother truth. He announced a curfew, then staged a midnight parade, lanterns swinging, drums dull as a funeral heart. He lined poor men along the wall and told them to remove their caps as he passed. One hesitated. A blow fell. Another hesitated. Another blow. He watched for fear to bloom and saw instead a kind of stillness that bled into contempt for his uniform. The wealthy merchant's note had changed nothing in his orders, and everything in the villagers' minds. The paradigm shifted under his boots, and he could not feel it, as a man on a frozen river cannot hear the groan below his own drum. By morning, the letters were moving across county lines like sparks riding wind. The printer heated his shop and set type with hands that had trembled once at the sight of red. Not now. He inked each page, and lifted it as if lifting a wounded comrade. Broadsides were rolled and slid into flour sacks. A widow tucked one into a hymnal. A stable hand pinned another beneath a saddle blanket, where a general might sit and feel the bump of his own indictment. Within the village, the ledger became scripture. The minister read the lines of theft from the pulpit with the same cadence he used for psalms, and the congregation answered with that stern murmur that means amen without surrendering a syllable. Martha gripped the back of the bench and did not weep. Thomas listened and made small marks on a scrap marks that meant roots. Marks that meant the garrison's pantry door hung crooked. Marks that meant a cart could be rolled as a shield if shoulders were set beneath it and hearts fixed above. Isaac returned to the yard at dusk and stared at the posts where men had nearly bled for another's fortune. He ran his thumb along the rope burns and made a private vow he did not voice. Some vows need only heaven to hear. Ephraim stood beside him. "We are not hunting one man," he said. "We are hunting a system." Isaac nodded. "And we are the hounds bred by their neglect." Rebecca moved through homes where suspicion had once divided neighbors. The letter had done what sermons couldn't. It had welded. The baker shared yeast with a woman who had once called him stubborn. The wheelwright gave a nail keg to a farmer he used to avoid at market. Children carried water to houses not their own without being asked. The town moved like a single body, bruised, waking, learning what its hands were for. Night collected the roofs. The garrison lights looked smaller, as if distance had increased, though no one had moved. Hargrove consulted his maps and wrote a new order, shaking with a fury he named discipline. Seize the river lots at the thaw. Punish those who pass papers. Make an example. The order lay wet with ink when a draft caught it and lifted it off the desk and out a crack in the casement. It fluttered into the yard like a blackbird, and a stable boy snatched it and hid it beneath his shirt and walked, not ran, to the meeting-house door. By the time the bell tolled for the evening hour, Bracken Hollow had chosen its direction with a clarity that startled even the brave. The raid would not end at an unlocked door or a freed wrist. The raid would end only when a people, armed first with proof and then with courage, stood where no uniform could command their souls to kneel. Snow whispered at the eaves. The river groaned and held. Lamps dimmed one by one as hands folded pages, wrapped wounds, and sharpened will. Somewhere in the garrison, Hargrove slept with a pistol under his pillow and a dream of compliance. Somewhere in the tavern, a map dried where spilled broth had blurred a road. Somewhere in a child's hiding place, a scrap waited beside a key and a hook for the moment when evidence must be read aloud under a sky that would remember. The spark had become a line of fire, thin, sure, advancing with the patience of winter toward the timbers stacked too long in the yard. Dawn came without color, a lid of iron pressed over sky and field. Frost gritted under boots as the first carts rolled from the barns, tar barrels hidden under turnips, pitch sealed with straw. The bell rope at the meeting-house hung slack. In the night, a careful hand had cut it clean, so no warning could be rung, so confusion would belong to the oppressor for once. Breath smoked. Eyes met. No speeches, only the grip of calloused palms and the understanding that some would not return. Sacrifice walked beside every man and woman who stepped into the lane. Thomas Clay took the north path with two lads no older than harvest. His bad leg dragged, but his mind cut straight. He touched the wheel wedges like a father checking a cradle. Isaac Turner passed among the shadows and set tinder where a barn's rafters met the cold. Rebecca tied a strip of white around Martha's wrist so they could find each other in smoke. Ephraim Hole looked to the river, listening for the ice's slow song. Then he turned toward the gate. The first fire lifted like a prayer torn open. A barn across the green bellowed sparks into gray light. Another answered on the far ridge. Flames wrote their own language against the sky signals no drum could drown. Hargrove's drummers struck leather, frantic, and the town heard a tune they would never bow to again. Redcoats spilled from the barracks with buckles flying. Muskets half-primed, faces pale where arrogance had slept. The carts rolled in. Axles creaked. Tar sloshed. A woman threw a torch under a wagon as it passed, and it became a black-flamed beast that lunged for the garrison wall. Heat bit stone. Smoke rolled low and oily. A curtain pulled across the yard. Isaac's squad slipped through it. They moved like men who had planted furrows at night, sure of each step, sure of each rut. The first volley cracked. Splinters leapt from the gate. A redcoat dropped with a sound that was more surprise than scream. Another returned fire, and a boy gasped and sat down hard, as if he'd forgotten he had legs. Rebecca reached him, pressed linen, met his eyes. Breathe. The boy breathed. Duty steadied his jaw. Hargrove strode into the yard, cloak thrown back, pistol high, and roared orders that sounded like a man drowning commanding the river to relent. He pointed toward the south wall where the old seam had been loosened by frost and patience. 2 soldiers ran. Thomas's wedge bit. The cart slammed sideways and pinned them against stone. Not a killing, a stoppage. Space carved for insurgents to cross. Close work began. Muskets fired at arm's length. Ramrods clanged. A farmer swung the butt of his gun and felt the jolt in his elbows, and the shame of it, and the necessity at once. A sentry thrust with bayonet, and met a pitchfork. The fork held. The bayonet slipped. Men shoved, slipped, cursed the ice, prayed under their breath. The sound of it all earned, wood, lungs became the terrible calculus of liberty being reckoned aloud. The minister stood by the gate and read not from a book but from memory, his voice a spine in the chaos, naming deliverance as if it were a place on a map they could walk to if they kept their feet. Elias ran messages like a fox, small and tireless, hair singed at the edges, face streaked with soot. He carried a nail for luck in his pocket, and the scrap of the officer's slur at his chest, and he delivered. Words that weighed more than muskets. Left open. Hold the drain. Keys found. Smoke thickened. The tar flare guttered and roared back. The gate timbers hissed and spat as if alive. Isaac took a step, then another, and shouldered into the bar with 3 others until it groaned like a falling tree. The bar cracked. The door gave a hand's width. Enough. Ephraim heaved. Thomas braced his bad leg and pushed until something in his hip screamed, and he ignored it. The gap widened. Cold air knifed into the yard and carried with it a rising murmur from the town, a sound that was not cheering and not mourning, but the raw voice of a people crossing a threshold. Hargrove's shot tore the haze. The ball chipped stone inches from Ephraim's head. He did not flinch. He had flinched 10,000 times before to older humiliations. He had no flinches left for this. He surged forward, caught the officer's wrist, and drove him back a pace. The pistol fell. They grappled like wrestlers in a winter. Barn boots sliding, breath burning. The major snarled words about subjects and sovereign discipline. Ephraim said nothing. He fought for land and for names long in the soil. 2 soldiers lunged to help their officer. Isaac cut one strap, and the man stumbled. The other paused a heartbeat at the sight of villagers bleeding for each other, and something in his face cracked. He stepped aside. Betrayal of a system begins with the smallest refusal. A blast from the parapet ripped shingles from the storehouse and showered the yard with wood. A widow screamed and then struck the shooter with a stone once, twice, until his hat rolled and his pride went with it. She stared at her own hand as if it belonged to an ancestor and a granddaughter at once. Dignity can be fierce. It does not apologize to uniforms. Rebecca moved like a thread through torn cloth. She tamped powder burns with snow. She bound wrists rubbed raw from ropes now fallen to mud. She closed one man's eyes and whispered his name, not to erase him, but to place him among those who had paid the first installment on independence. She found Martha kneeling by a fallen lad and steadied her. He breathes. The 2 women held him between them and walked him backward to the church steps, where the world narrowed to pulse and prayer and sharp commands that sounded like lullabies. At the north wall the seam finally yawned. Men poured through, tired and grim and astonished by what their own hands could do. Inside the barracks, a ledger chest sat open-proof, no longer hidden. A militiaman tore out pages and passed them hand to hand like communion. The papers reached the minister. He lifted them high in smoke and ash and read a single line with a voice that carried beyond fear. Obedience made visible. The crowd answered with silence so full that Hargrove turned his head as if struck. The major rallied a knot of loyalists and charged. He crashed into Ephraim and Isaac together and drove them hard toward the gate. For a moment it seemed the old order would reassert itself by the sheer privilege of habit. Then Thomas braced, shouted a single word, "Now," and the jammed cart rolled with a heave, seizing the gap and pinning Hargrove's men where they could no longer swing their courage like clubs. A deserter ripped the king's crest from the mess hall door and flung it into the tar pit, where it curled and blackened. No trumpet marked the turning, only the sound of boots stumbling as a people reclaimed the center of its own yard. The fight did not end. It changed temperature. Redcoats still fired from windows. Villagers still fell and were lifted and fell again. The air tasted of salt and soot. Rope smoldered and snapped, and the smell of burned hemp etched itself into memory. But the calculus had shifted. Fear moved to the officer's eyes. Resolve settled like a mantle on the poor. The garrison that had been a theater of shame became a place of judgment, and every judgment found the same measure. Worth is not stamped in wax. It is proven in the willingness to bleed for another. Hargrove stumbled, cloak torn, face gray with disbelief. He reached for a dropped saber and found Rebecca's boot upon it. She did not speak. She did not need to. He saw his power reflected in her calm, and at last understood what terror truly is, confronting a dignity you cannot buy, whip, or mock into surrender. He jerked back, slipped on ash, and vanished into the knot of his remaining men. Snow began again, hushed and relentless. The fires hissed but held. The last volley stuttered, then ebbed. Along the wall, a boy's thin voice called for water, and 5 hands answered. Along the gate, a farmer leaned his head to the wood and exhaled a prayer with no words. Along the green, elders rose from their knees with the stiffness of age and the steadiness of granite. The courtyard was a ledger of bodies, of emptied carts, of scorched rope ends curling like dead snakes. Loss and deliverance braided into one hard rope. No wind could fray, they did not celebrate, they counted. They gathered their wounded and their dead. They stamped embers and opened shutters and let clean air wash the smoke's judgment from their lungs. Papers were stacked on the pulpit. Keys were hung on the meeting-house hook, as if returning a borrowed thing to its rightful place. The minister closed his eyes and thanked the author of liberty without asking for reward. Isaac stared at his hands and flexed them, as if surprised to find them still attached to a life. Ephraim stood in the doorway of the ledger room and looked out over the yard that had been a stage for degradation and was now a testimony. Beyond the walls, riders were already moving with copies under their cloaks. Beyond the river, other bells would fail to ring and other barns would flare at the edges. Freedom's cost had been counted here, under a winter sky. The sum was terrible. The sum was accepted, and yet the journey was not finished. A broken garrison bleeds. But a machine has many gears. There would be reprisals. There would be orders from men who had never seen this yard, inked with the same indifference that had birthed the first insult. Bracken Hollow stood, smoky and stern, and understood what must follow. Not a riot, a reckoning. They dragged Major Hargrove to the green at noon, wrists bound with the same rope that had bitten the villagers at dawn. Snow lay trodden and gray, where the garrison's shadow used to fall like a decree. The stocks stood ready, but no one moved to open them. The bell had no rope, yet the square thrummed like a heart about to speak. Here on this very ground Rebecca had been dragged through disgrace. Here the town would decide whether justice meant a clean blade or a cleaner future. Hargrove's cloak was torn. His sash hung crooked. He still tried to summon command with a stare. It meant something older. Farmers who had buried sons. Women who had sold heirlooms to buy grain. Elders who remembered rents that climbed like frost on glass. Isaac Turner read from the ledger with the voice of a plowman calling furrows. Bribes named gratitudes. Fines masked as morals. Inspections listed like a butcher's tally. Then Ephraim Hull held up the merchant's letter. He did not raise it like a trophy. He lifted it as evidence. Paid to clear the river lots, he said, to break tenant farms, to teach obedience by fear. The square inhaled, not shock, confirmation. Betrayal had a signature now. Voices broke in. Gusts. Hang him, try him, send him to the county, make him dig the graves of our dead, make him speak the truth. Rage had its reasons, grief had its claims. The minister stood with his Bible closed, thumb on the worn leather. He said nothing yet. He waited for the noise to show its wound. Rebecca stepped forward, palms open, shawl singed, hair ash-dusted, face composed with a calm that was not softness. A dignity stolen cannot be returned by spectacle, she said. Her words traveled, like iron filings to a magnet. The crowd leaned inward. Humiliation made us. Humiliation will not cure us. We seek liberty, not theater. We seek a reckoning that teaches our children to stand, not to gloat. Hargrove tried to laugh. The sound died in the cold. She faced him without flinching. You turned mercy into an insult. You turned hunger into policy. You called shame instruction. The hidden truth is open now. There will be judgment, but not the one you staged for us, some shouted. Back, blood for blood, in their grief deserved air. Rebecca did not scold it. She let it pass over like a wind that must spend itself before a field can hear again. Martha Hale touched her daughter's sleeve and nodded once, jaw set. Thomas Clay leaned on his cane and waited for the words that could bear the town across the narrow place between rage and renewal. Isaac lifted the letter once more, then handed it to the minister. The old man read the merchant's lines aloud with the cadence he saved for psalms, to be done without undue noise. He closed the page, eyes bright. We will give them noise, he said softly, but not the kind they expect, not the howl of a mob. The roar of a people becoming a nation. Ephraim called for those most wronged. The miller whose scales had been slandered. The men who had been bound to posts at dawn. The mother whose boy had been listed for inspection. They came forward, thin and upright, carrying more than injury. They carried the town's right. To decide your verdict, Ephraim said. Not the crowd's. Yours. The miller spoke first. Few words. He took my bins and called it law. I will not become what he is. He pointed to Hargrove's sash. Strip him. Strip the rank that let him sell our lives. The bound men spoke next. "We could let him swing," one said, voice raw, "but a corpse teaches less than a witness." He looked at the pages. Let him carry his own crimes on his chest. The mother placed her palm on her son's head and said, "He named my child a number. Let him be numbered as we march him through every town that paid him." No quaver, only decision. Murmurs steadied into assent. Not mercy for its own sweetness, discipline for a higher end. The deserter stepped behind Hargrove and cut the sash. It fell. Isaac took the gilt gorget from his neck and placed it on the meeting-house steps as if returning stolen plate to an altar. Thomas produced a length of chain, not heavy, not theatrical, enough to bind a man to his deeds. Ephraim pinned the letter and a ledger page to Hargrove's breast with twine. Proof must be visible. Spectacle must serve truth. A boy handed the minister a nail, the very nail Elias had kept for luck. The minister tapped it into the post and fixed the packet higher, where all could read even if the prisoner lowered his head. He didn't. Pride can be stubborn even under frost. Rebecca faced the crowd again. "He will stand here until the sun touches the church door," she said, "and we will read what he did until every child knows the shape of his betrayal. Then we take him in irons to the merchant's estate. We will drag complicity into daylight. We will require signatures in the square, not whispers in salons. We will place these pages on their table and ask them to deny their own hands." "Who guards the road?" someone called. "We all do," Martha answered, voice iron. "Widows at the wells, boys at fence lines, men at the fords. This is our journey now." Heads lifted, not in wrath, alone, in recognition. Rebecca turned to Hargrove once more. "You demanded a lesson. Here is one. Authority exists to defend the weak. When it betrays that charge, it forfeits reverence. We will not crush you for sport. We will escort you as evidence." For a heartbeat, a flicker crossed the officer's face, relief tangled with dread. Living judgment is a longer road than a drop and a silence. Elias climbed the meeting-house step and began to read, his small voice carrying because the square had become a chapel. He read the insult first, the very words that had soaked a woman in shame. Then he read the sums, the dates, the neat hand that priced obedience. When he reached to be cleared before spring, his mouth tightened. The page shook. Rebecca took his shoulder lightly, and the quiver stilled. He finished. The square did not cheer. It breathed. The minister raised his hand. "We bind not only a man," he said, "but a pattern. We will carry him to those who paid him and ask the land itself to witness." Isaac stepped to the prisoner's side. Ephraim took the chain. Thomas gestured toward the road that curved past the frozen river and climbed toward the merchant's tall house, where glass glittered like arrogance in winter sun. A final question hung in the air, one that could not be spoken without cheapening it. Could a town that had learned rebellion learn government? Rebecca answered it without naming it. She gathered a basket, handed bread to the readers, water to the wounded, and a shawl to a child whose lips were blue. Liberty must feed its own, or it starves into cruelty. Dignity must be tended like coals, or it gutters. They formed a column, quiet, stern, unadorned. Farmers with rope burns. Militiamen with powder smoke on their sleeves. Widows with faces set like stone. Children walking as if taller by an inch. Hargrove in the center, chain at his waist, papers on his chest, eyes fixed on a horizon that had never included his judgment until this hour. The square emptied into the lane, and the lane became a river of will. Overhead the sky held a thin winter blue, and the wind moved across the fields where spring would come late because winter had been long and hard. The garrison, torn and blackened, stood behind them like a page turned, but not yet bound. Ahead, the merchant's estate waited with its columns and ledgers and the old lie that property outranks people. Between them stretched the road of consequences, a hard mile, and then another, and then the threshold where the next revelation must be faced without flinching. Right, the flame of freedom lives in me. They reached the merchant's road as the sun thinned to a pale coin, and there the column slowed, not from fear, but from the weight of what they carried. Hargrove stumbled on ruts his maps had never noted. The chain scraped. Pages rustled on his chest like a second heartbeat. Rebecca set the pace without command. She stopped at every ditch where old women faltered. She steadied boys whose jaws trembled only when no one watched. She lifted a waterskin to the lips of a deserter who coughed blood and would not admit it. She spoke little. When she did, it was to name what mattered: bread, warmth, witness. Not vengeance, never spectacle. Behind them the garrison smoked, charred ribs against the sky, and already its timbers meant something different. Not dominion, declaration. News streaked ahead. Smoke spoke to smoke. A farm bell rang far off, and then another. Though the ropes were cut, hands beat iron on plowshares, and the sound carried across the frozen fields like a summons older than any crown. Men stepped from hedges to fall in beside the column. Women emerged with shawls and blankets, pressed them on strangers, then fell in too. A journey became a procession. A procession became a covenant. At the crest above the river, Rebecca halted. She looked down on the merchant's house column, stiff as arrogance, glass winking with the cold stare of money. She did not point. She did not raise a fist. She turned back to the town and said, "We hold a people's reckoning, or we become what we fought." Her words were not soft. They were steel pulled from a sheath. Isaac nodded. Ephraim set his palm to the letter on Hargrove's chest, as if to keep the truth from slipping back into the dark. They returned with their prisoner at dusk, because the dead asked to be counted before night. The square waited, stern and rhymed. Fires burned in braziers made from broken buckets. The wounded lay in rows near the meeting house, each face a page in the nation's first book of sacrifice. Rebecca moved among them like a lantern. She assigned beds. She set boys to fetch snow in basins. She sent elders to sit by the smallest children, to tell them that independence sounds like a heartbeat, not a drum. She found the body of a farmer who had once mocked her herbs. She closed his eyes and washed the dust from his beard with water warmed in her hands. Then she took a saw to the blackened beams of the garrison and said, "Here." Thomas understood. He cut a plank, smoothed the edges, and raised it on 2 rocks, a pulpit born of ash. She climbed it without ceremony. The square hushed. Hargrove stood below, chained to the post that had witnessed shame. His eyes flickered to the timber, and something in him recognized the indictment of symbols turned. The minister handed Rebecca the letter and the ledger page. She read, not in fury, in the cadence of truth. Read the price set on obedience. She read the instruction to clear river lots without noise. She read the neat numbers that measured children as units of labor to be bent. Each sentence landed like a shovel of earth on the old order's coffin. When she finished, she did not look up for applause. She said, "We will bury our dead with dignity. We will shelter our widows. We will feed our hungry. We will send copies to every hearth where a redcoat has laughed." Her voice did not rise. It deepened. "We will not let this garrison's memory be a tool of terror. We will make it a warning to those who trade in betrayal." Word peeled off that plank and ran like fire in dry grass. A rider took the first broadside and pushed into the night. Another followed, then a third. By morning, neighboring towns spoke the name Bracken Hollow as if naming a star newly seen. They spoke of a woman dragged through disgrace who refused to let the mud define her. They spoke of farmers who counted not only their crops but their courage. They spoke of a minister who read ledgers as scripture, and of children who carried proof like relics. The story leapt fences. It climbed hills. It crossed frozen creeks. It arrived in places where merchants had ruled unchallenged and found the ground already restless. Hargrove heard the murmurs and tried once more for mastery. He spat at the plank and muttered about rebels and rope. No one answered him. Silence became judgment, and it bit harder than any lash. He stood, while Rebecca worked binding, boiling water, assigning watches, sending young backs to carry wood, commanding nothing, ordering everything. She refused to glorify the blood on the cobbles. She refused to name killing holy. She called it cost. She named each fallen by name and set a candle for each and said the same sentence over every flame. "Your sacrifice purchases a future we will be worthy of." People wept then, not for victory, for responsibility. The merchant's carriage arrived at last, flanked by 2 armed riders who wore more lace than courage. He stepped down nose high, fury masked as courtesy. He asked for dialogue. He asked for compromise. He asked who had dared to touch his name. Rebecca met him on the ashwood plank with the letter in hand and the town at her back and said, "We did." He tried to smile. It cracked. She read his own words to his face. He reached for explanations. She handed him results. The minister extended the ledger for his signature beside a confession already pinned by those who had counted people as grain. He hesitated, trapped between pride and exposure. Ephraim said nothing. Isaac said nothing. Martha said, "You will not buy our silence a second time." The merchant looked at Hargrove's chain and at the square and at the blackened bones of the garrison and saw a transformation he could not bribe back into sleep. He signed, not out of contrition, out of survival. The paper shook like a leaf and then lay still. The town exhaled, a low sound that was not joy and not forgiveness. It was order returning to the hands that deserved it. That night, snow fell in wide, quiet flakes. The dead were carried to the ridge where the earth would open when the thaw came. Stones were placed. Names were spoken. The pulpit remained on the green, a scar-turned altar. Rebecca stood beside it until the last candle guttered, then went to the meeting house and laid down among the women and children and slept for the first time in days. Not long. Enough to dream she was walking along the river at dusk, and the water spoke. Not in words, but in a steady sound that meant keep. Dawn found riders from 3 towns waiting at the lane. They had come not to spectate, but to learn. They asked for copies, for recipes of poultices, for sketches of gates and signals, for the simple truth told plainly, how to shape rebellion into responsibility. Rebecca gave them what she had: lists, herbs, roots. She pressed the blackened splinters of the garrison into their palms as talismans and said, "Do not worship our smoke. Build your own courage." They nodded, faces fierce with a new kind of hope that tasted of duty. By noon the estate on the ridge closed its shutters. The merchant had sent a boy with a snow shovel and a note begging to be left alone. No one answered. The town had found larger work. Office had been reclaimed by those who bear the weight of winter and still plant for spring. A symbol had taken root where a gallows once threatened. A woman's quiet refusal had become a banner not of cloth but of conduct. And the road drew long ahead, reprisals certain, trials waiting, a broader struggle assembling like weather on a far horizon. The column that had marched out returned slimmer and harder, but not hollow. Their independence was no longer a rumor. It was a task. The wind shifted, the smoke thinned. Children chased each other across the green, careful near the candles, bold near the plank. Hargrove sat chained, silent now, reading the papers he had once sent, as if at last he recognized the shape of his own downfall. The square held him, but it looked beyond him to couriers riding, to towns waking, to maps being redrawn by hands that had learned their strength. The flame had leapt from one hearth to another, stubborn in the cold, steady in the dark. And the journey, demanding and unfinished, moved on with a new name written in its margins: Bracken Hollow. The green of Bracken Hollow no longer smelled of shame. It smelled of ash, of sweat, of soil turned by boots that had stood instead of bowed. The garrison lay in ruin, its timbers blackened, its flag burned, yet from its wreckage rose something stronger than stone. A pulpit carved from charred beams. A letter read to every ear, its lines now seared into memory. A woman once dragged into the mud had become the steadfast voice of a people learning to name themselves free. Rebecca did not seek glory. She mended, she buried, she gave bread where hunger lingered, and in doing so became the banner the wind could not tear down. Word ran faster than riders. Villagers whispered Bracken Hollow as if it were scripture, not merely a place, but a testament. They spoke of a struggle that began with degradation and ended with dignity. They spoke of betrayal exposed, of sacrifice made visible, of the transformation of humiliation into strength. They spoke of the flame that had been kindled by one act of cruelty, but fanned into rebellion by endurance, patience, and decision. The tale no longer belonged to one town, it belonged to the land itself. Children repeated the story at hearths. Elders folded it into prayers. Farmers carried it in the rhythm of their plows. Soldiers deserting the crown carried it across rivers and into camps where weary men weighed whether to keep bowing. And everywhere the same revelation: independence is not born of speeches, but of wounds borne with honor, of choices made when defeat seemed easier, of blood given, not for empire but for neighbors. Rebecca watched the riders vanish into snow and knew reprisal would come. Redcoats would march again, merchants would demand repayment, nobles would conspire. But none of them could erase what had happened on the green. Dignity, once reclaimed, cannot be sold back. The hidden truth had been dragged into the light, and with it the conviction that even the humblest hands could steer the course of history. The villagers gathered by the plank that had become their altar, the ashes still warm beneath it. Ephraim spoke of duty, Isaac of vigilance, Martha of sacrifice, Thomas of patience. Rebekah said nothing at first. Then she raised her head and her voice, steady as a river in thaw. They thought to silence us with insult. They thought to command us with fear. They thought to erase us with ledgers. Instead, they have written our beginning. What we built here will not die with fire or rope. It will walk with us and with our children until liberty is the common breath of this land. Silence followed, not hollow, but full. It was the silence of a people understanding themselves at last. Not subjects, patriots, not victims, architects of their own fate. So the story closes not in triumph, but in vigilance, not in comfort, but in duty. The struggle begun at Bracken Hollow is the struggle that forges nations. The sacrifice paid there is the seed of independence that will not wither. The eternal flame of liberty burns in the ashes, in the scars, in the names spoken over graves, and in the living who carry the banner forward. If this story has reached your heart, let its fire remain with you. Leave your voice among ours and write, "The flame of freedom burns in me." Or say, "I stand with the patriots until the end." For stories such as these are not only told, they are kept alive by those who carry them. And if your spirit is not yet weary, the journey continues. Here is another story of courage and sacrifice. Click and walk with me.